Dr. Mara Voss stepped off the shuttle holding a bag that was half field equipment and half granola bars. Nobody had told her to bring the granola bars. She brought them anyway. 3 previous expeditions had taught her that alien catering ran toward nutrient paste that tasted like someone had described food to a person who had never eaten any. The planet was called Orath Secundus. It had thin air and a sun that sat too low in the sky, pale and distant, like it was watching from a safe distance. The ruins were 2 kilometers from the landing pad. The team walked. Nobody offered to carry anything for her. She did not ask. She used the walk to look at things. The ruins of the Veth civilization covered 4 square kilometers of open, windswept ground, broken columns, archways without roofs, walls that had stood through 40,000 years of weather and were not finished standing yet. The stone was a deep, tired gray, the color of something that had been rained on longer than most civilizations had existed. She had read all 11 published reports on Orath Secundus before boarding the shuttle. She had read them twice. She had printed 2 of them and read them a 3rd time on paper, with a pencil, marking sentences in the margins. The other members of the team probably assumed she was doing this because she was new to multi-species fieldwork and wanted to catch up. That was not entirely wrong. It was also not the whole reason. The whole reason was that she wanted to know exactly what everyone else had concluded before she looked at anything herself. It was an old habit, careful and useful, and hers. The consensus from 63 years of study was clear. The symbols carved into the walls of the Veth ruins were decorative, artistic expression, cultural flourish. The Veth equivalent of ornamental tilework, beautiful in an alien way, but carrying no more meaning than a pattern on a rug. 4 expeditions, 11 peer-reviewed papers, 1 conclusion, arrived at unanimously by some of the most respected academic minds in the Galactic Consortium. Meaningless. Mara walked and looked at the stones and said nothing. Arch-Curator Delvin met them at the entrance to the main excavation. He was tall, even by Veth standards, and had the particular stillness of a man who had been the most important person in most rooms for a very long time and had grown comfortable living there. His credentials filled 3 published volumes. His handshake, the Veth version, a brief press of the back of the hand, was practiced and warm in the way warmth becomes when it is performed every day for decades. Genuine enough. Automatic. He gave the orientation tour personally. Mara understood what this was. The Galactic Consortium had inclusion requirements. Each expedition to a site of multi-species significance was expected to include representatives of at least 3 different civilizations. She was the human representative. The box that got ticked. The diversity appointment that let the consortium file its paperwork and feel good about itself afterward. She had been the human representative on 3 expeditions before this one. She had learned to treat it as a resource, rather than an insult. Being underestimated, she had found over many years in many rooms full of people more credentialed than her, was a tremendous advantage as long as you knew it was happening and kept your face still. Delvin explained the site with the patient thoroughness of a man explaining something to someone he did not expect to follow it entirely. The excavation layers, the dating methods, the cultural traditions of the Veth as a people, their artistic schools, their philosophical systems, their deep love of what Delvin called expressive geometry. The symbols on the walls, he said, were the finest example of Veth expressive geometry ever recorded. The main wall was 30 meters long and 7 meters high, carved from the floor to the ceiling, every surface covered. The symbols curled and stacked and repeated in tight, layered patterns that the Kwarathi pattern recognition specialists, the finest in the known galaxy, brought in specifically for the 3rd expedition, had spent 2 full years analyzing. Their methods were exhaustive. Their equipment was the best available. Their conclusion was thorough and formally published. No mathematical framework applied. No linguistic structure mapped onto the arrangement. No pattern resolved into meaning of any kind. The wall was beautiful. The wall said nothing. Delvin said this the way people say things that are settled not cruelly, just finally, with the calm ease of a man standing on solid ground. Mara walked the length of the wall. She moved slowly. The rest of the team had already drifted ahead, falling into the comfortable groupings of scholars who already knew each other well. Their voices overlapped in 3 or 4 different languages, the translation software humming through all of it, in a low, constant undertone, at the edge of hearing. She stopped. Near the base of the wall, roughly a third of the way from the right end, there was a cracked tile. The crack was old. The stone edges had been worn smooth by thousands of years of cold and moisture, working into the gap. It ran diagonally through one of the carved symbols, splitting it cleanly in 2. Mara crouched down. She looked at the 2 halves for a long moment. The left half had 2 strokes cut into it. The right half had 3. Together they made a shape that every prior analysis, every published paper, every database entry, every photograph had recorded as a single glyph. One carved unit. One piece of the overall decorative pattern. But the crack showed the inside of the thing. She could see clearly that the 2 halves had been carved separately and then joined at the seam. They were not one glyph. They were a compound. 2 component parts that combined to make a single unit when the stone was whole. She looked up at the wall. At the other symbols. She looked at them the way you look at something, when a small piece of information has just changed the shape of the whole picture. She stood up, brushed the dust from her knees. "What if they're numbers?" she said. Her voice came out level. Professional. The same tone she used for everything, which was the tone of a woman who had learned that keeping your voice flat meant nobody could tell what you were thinking until you were ready for them to know. Delvin stopped walking. The Kwarathi junior researcher nearest to them, young, still early in his career, still capable of being moved by a new idea, turned around with a politely neutral expression that was working hard. Delvin's expression was kind. That was the part she noted. Not dismissive. Kind. The specific kindness of a man preparing to explain, gently, why an interesting idea does not quite hold up. The symbols have been analyzed under 17 distinct mathematical frameworks, he said. Base 10. Base 12. Several hybrid positional systems. The Kwarathi team is thorough. Nothing produces coherent output. Sure thing, Mara said. Delvin looked at her for a moment. Then he laughed. It was a warm laugh. Not a cruel one. Not mocking. Just comfortable, the sound of a man who has been right for 63 years and has no particular reason to think that today is different. The laugh spread through the group the way these things spread when there is context behind them. The context here being 4 expeditions and 11 papers and 1 human scholar, on her first day, quietly suggesting that everyone had missed something. Someone near the back of the group said something in Veth. The translator rendered it, diplomatically, as the perspective of new eyes. It was not meant as a compliment. Mara pulled out her field notebook. Real paper, which she carried on purpose, because it gave her hands something to do, and gave everyone else something small to find slightly odd about her. And people who are busy finding you mildly eccentric are not paying close attention to your face. She started writing. She wrote down everything she had just seen. The cracked tile, the 2 halves, the component strokes, the way the glyph looked, when you could see what it was actually made of. She drew small diagrams in the margins, careful and exact. Around her, the team settled back into its work. Instruments hummed. Voices resumed. The expedition moved on. The low sun drifted a little further across the pale sky. The gray stones kept everything they had always kept. Mara filled 4 pages without looking up once. She worked nights. The team assumed this was because she was behind, catching up on context the rest of them already had. Let them assume. It cost her nothing. The excavation chamber was quieter after dark anyway, and real thinking required the kind of silence that Delvin's expedition did not produce during daylight hours. They were fine scholars, every one of them. They were also, without exception, very comfortable with the sound of their own translated voices. Mara brought her thermos, her notebook, her small portable lamp, and her remaining granola bars. She set the lamp close to the base of the wall where the cracked tile was, and sat on the cold stone floor, and got to work. The first problem was the base system. Every prior analysis had assumed that the symbols operated in either base 10, the Veth standard, the foundation of their entire mathematical tradition, or base 12, which was the Kwarathi system, the reason the Kwarathi specialists had been brought in at all. Neither framework had produced anything useful. The consortium's conclusion from this: no mathematical structure present in the symbols. Mara thought about that conclusion for a while. Then she set it to one side. She went back to what the cracked tile had shown her. The symbol was a compound. Two carved components joined together. And those components were made of strokes. Simple, individual cuts in the stone. She had been counting them all day while the team ran their instruments, quietly, keeping the counts in the margins of her notebook, where they looked like idle sketching. She pulled out the notebook now and looked at what she had. 10 distinct stroke types. Across the entire wall, every carved compound, every symbol, was built from combinations of these same 10 strokes. No more, no less. 10 shapes, repeated and combined, making up the whole vocabulary of the wall. She wrote them out in a row across the top of a clean page. 10 strokes. Not base 10, not base 12. She thought about a class she had taken in her first year of university, taught by an old woman named Dr. Yuen, who had a habit of beginning every single lecture with the same sentence, delivered in the flat, patient voice of someone who had said it many times and meant it every single time. The universe has no obligation to count the way you do. She thought, what if the base system is something nobody tested because nobody thought it was reasonable? She stared at her row of 10 stroke types, 10 symbols. A base system built on 10 distinct shapes. But a base 10 system would use those 10 shapes as its complete set of digits, 0 through 9, and the math would run in familiar powers of 10. She had already checked this herself. It did not work. The values did not resolve. But if each compound on the wall was not a single digit, but a positional construction, if the location of a stroke within the compound changed its value, then the system was not base 10 at all. The 10 strokes were not digits. They were components, building blocks, and a system of components used in positions was capable of expressing something much larger than 10 values. She started mapping positions. Each compound on the wall had between 2 and 4 stroke components arranged in a specific structure. She began treating the position of each component, top, bottom, left, right, center, as a place value indicator. She assigned preliminary numerical values to each stroke type and started running the combinations. At midnight, she found the pattern. The system was base 11. She sat with that for a moment. Just sat with it, looking at what she had written. Nobody counted in base 11. It was not an impossible system. Mathematically, it was perfectly sound, but it was strange. An unusual choice. You arrived at base 11 if you were working from a foundation of 10 component symbols, plus one additional state. A null. A zero. A placeholder that said, this position is empty, nothing is here, but the position still exists and still matters. A zero was not an obvious invention. Many civilizations never developed the concept independently. The ones that did, she stopped herself. Too fast. The math first. She went back to the wall and started over from the beginning, with base 11 in mind. By 2 in the morning, she had 40 sequential values mapped and confirmed. She wrote them in a column down the left side of a page and read them back. They were not random. They were not decorative. They were building. Each value was constructed from the ones before it. They accumulated, resolved, and then folded forward into a larger expression that incorporated everything that had come before it. The pattern was precise and deliberate, and it moved in one clear direction. She knew what this shape was. She had seen it before, in a structural engineering textbook she had read during a quiet semester, because the university library was free, and she had run out of her usual reading material. She had not expected to need that book again. She had kept the knowledge anyway, the way you keep things that seem useless, because sometimes the world surprises you. This was a proof. A mathematical proof, the kind that builds from small established values toward a large conclusion. Each step supported by the step before it. Nothing included that did not earn its place. Step by step across 30 meters of stone, in a base 11 number system carved by hands that had been dust for 40,000 years. The wall was not a list of numbers. The wall was an argument. A demonstration. Something was being shown, proved, established, and the proof was still here, still intact, still readable by anyone who sat in front of it long enough and looked at it the right way. She ate her last peanut butter granola bar. She had been saving it. She ate it slowly and read the proof from the beginning again. Load values, force distribution, stress ratios across curved surfaces under varying conditions of gravitational pull. The mathematics of construction, not small construction, not modest construction. Something very large, very heavy, and designed to hold itself together under forces that required very specific and very serious engineering to survive. She looked up from her notebook at the ruins around her. The standing walls, the broken columns, the simple, weathered structures of the Veth excavation site. Nothing here came close to requiring these calculations. The engineering proof on this wall was describing something that this site could not contain. Something larger. Something that had either stood somewhere else or no longer existed anywhere at all. She wrote one word in the margin of her notebook. Ship. She looked at it for a moment. Then she wrote beneath it. Built to leave atmosphere. Built for pressure differential. Built for a journey with no road. She closed the notebook. She capped the thermos, picked up her lamp, and walked back through the dark ruins toward the dormitory. Her footsteps were quiet on the old stone path. Above her, the stars of Orath Secundus were thick and cold and very far away. She needed a few hours of sleep. Tomorrow she was going to ask Delvin for time in front of the full team. He would give it to her because refusing the human observer would create paperwork problems, and Delvin avoided paperwork problems with the same energy he applied to everything else. He was going to regret agreeing. She walked through the dark and thought about base 11 and zeros, and the specific kind of civilization that invented a null state before it invented anything else. She asked for 30 minutes of the team's time after breakfast. Delvin granted it the way a king grants a small petition with visible, generous tolerance, the manner of a man who has already decided the answer is no, but wants it on record that he was fair about the process. He gestured toward the open area near the main display equipment and told the team to gather, and they gathered. And he stood at the edge of the group, with his hands folded and his expression composed and settled. 9 scholars in a half circle. 1 human at the front, with a notebook and a portable display unit she had borrowed from the equipment locker without asking. Because asking would have given someone a chance to say no. She did not use slides. She used the display to show the wall itself, a high-resolution photograph of the full 30-meter surface, taken from directly in front so every symbol was visible and undistorted. She had taken the photograph herself at 5 that morning, before anyone else was up. She pointed to the cracked tile first. She showed them what the crack revealed. The 2 halves. The separate components. The fact that every symbol on the wall, examined closely, was built from the same 10 basic stroke types, combined in specific positional arrangements. She had marked up a section of the photograph with a color-coded overlay, each stroke type in a different color, so the structure became visible in a way that was hard to argue with once you could see it. The team looked at it. Nobody laughed this time. That was the first change. Fell, the junior Kwarathi researcher, leaned slightly forward. He was the youngest person in the room, and had not yet developed the habit of keeping his reactions controlled, which meant his face was doing honest things. His face was saying, "That is not what I expected to see." Mara explained the base system. She explained how she had identified the positional structure, how she had tested the base 11 hypothesis, how it had confirmed across every compound on the wall without a single exception. She showed her mapping work the 40 sequential values she had decoded, laid out in a clean column with the corresponding base 11 notation next to each one. Delvin opened his mouth. Mara clicked to the next image before he could speak. The values in sequence. The way they accumulated. The way each value built on the last. The shape of the whole thing when you read it as a continuous construction, rather than a collection of individual symbols. She said, "This is a proof. A mathematical demonstration, built step by step. Somebody carved an argument into this wall. And the argument is about engineering." And she showed the load calculations. She walked them through the mathematics slowly, in simple terms, translating the base 11 notation into standard Veth numerical format as she went, so that nobody could claim they could not follow the conversion. She was patient. She was precise. She gave the numbers time to sit in the air before she moved to the next ones. The proof described forces, pressures, the distribution of enormous stress across curved surfaces, the tolerances required for a structure to hold together under conditions that normal planetary construction never had to account for: pressure differential, sustained acceleration, the specific violence of leaving a gravity well at speed and not breaking apart on the way out. She said, "Whatever this math is describing, it was designed to travel." The room was quiet. Not the quiet from the first day, when Delvin had laughed and the others had followed. That had been the quiet of people waiting for the punchline to finish so they could respond to it. This quiet was different. This was the quiet of 9 very intelligent people running the numbers in their heads and arriving somewhere they had not planned to go. Delvin adjusted the position of his translation interface on the table beside him, then adjusted it again. His hands needed somewhere to be. Fel said very quietly, to nobody in particular, "The load ratios. Can you run the load ratios again?" It was not really a question. Mara ran them again. The mathematics on the wall, this wall that 63 years of scholarship had agreed was decorative, meaningless. Artistic noise described a structure approximately 4 kilometers in height. It described a structure capable of sustaining an internal atmospheric pressure significantly higher than the external environment surrounding it. It described a hull, a sealed environment, a vessel. Elder Sovath spoke. He was the oldest member of the team, a Veth scholar of advanced age, who had been mostly silent for the first 3 days of the expedition. He had a habit of watching things without commenting on them, which Mara had noticed and respected, because it was a habit she recognized. He sat at the back of the group, and he had not moved during her presentation, but his eyes had been on the display the whole time. He said, "A ship." One word. Flat and certain. Everyone looked at him. "These are the engineering proofs," he said, "for a ship." The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a word lands in the right place, and everyone in the room knows it. The word sat in the middle of the group, like something with weight. Delvin began to speak. He was measured and careful, as he always was, and he said that while this interpretation was creative and clearly the product of serious work, extraordinary claims required extraordinary evidence, and that 63 years of established consortium scholarship could not simply be set aside on the basis of a single alternative reading, and that the proper process would involve peer review and independent verification, and Mara clicked to the next image. The load tolerances, the material requirements, the specific tensile strength that the engineering proof demanded for its calculations to be physically achievable, not theoretically, not approximately, but exactly achievable with real materials in the real physical world. The number was very large. It was also, by a significant margin, larger than the tensile strength of any material currently in use anywhere in the known galaxy. She let the number sit on the display. She watched Delvin's expression. She watched Fel's expression. She watched Elder Sovath, who was not looking at the display at all but at a point somewhere on the floor in front of his feet, in the way of a person whose mind has gone somewhere and taken the rest of him with it. "Currently," she said. One word. She let it do its work. The material this wall required did not exist in current galactic consortium engineering. Somebody had built with it anyway. 40,000 years ago, somebody had run the math, proved the engineering, and built something 4 kilometers tall that could hold pressure and survive the forces of leaving a planet. And they had done it with a material that the most advanced civilizations in the known galaxy had not yet managed to produce. The question of where that material was now hung in the air above the group, and nobody reached for it. Delvin adjusted his translation interface a 3rd time. Mara closed her notebook and waited. The meeting that followed lasted 4 hours. It was not the kind of meeting that produced conclusions. It was the kind that produces the conditions for conclusions: long, careful, occasionally heated, with long silences in between the heated parts, while everyone thought about what the last person had said and whether they wanted to be the one to agree with it. Delvin was careful and measured throughout. Fel said almost nothing but took notes with the concentrated focus of someone who would be thinking about those notes for the rest of his career. Elder Sovath sat at the back and watched. At the end of the 4 hours, Delvin said that the decoding was interesting. He used the word interesting, the way academics use it, when they mean something much stronger, but are not ready to say so out loud, and that the team would need to independently verify the base 11 framework before any formal conclusions could be drawn. Mara said, "Sure thing." She went to her bunk and slept for 3 hours. Then she got up and went back to the wall. The material problem was the center of everything. She had known this since the night before, when she had written ship in the margin of her notebook and stared at the load tolerances and understood what they meant. The engineering proof was real. The math was clean. But a proof is only as useful as the physical world that makes it possible. And the physical world specifically, the known physical world as understood and catalogued by 60 years of galactic consortium materials, science did not contain anything that could make this structure real. This was the argument Delvin would use. She had heard the shape of it in his careful language during the 4-hour meeting. He had not said it directly yet, but it was coming. A mathematical proof that requires impossible materials is not a proof of something that was built. It is a proof of something that could not be. She sat in front of the wall and thought about Dr. Yuan. Not the xenomathematics class this time. A different memory. A conversation after class, during office hours, in a small office crowded with papers and empty teacups, when Mara had been 22 years old and frustrated by a material science prerequisite that kept insisting on limits, she found irritating. Dr. Yuan had said, "The consortium reviewed our tensile theory and called it overreach. We kept using it because it worked." Those are not the same problem. The Halvorsen-Yuan dynamic field theory was, in galactic consortium academic circles, a mildly embarrassing chapter in the history of human physics. It had been developed in the early 22nd century, before first contact, before humanity knew there was a galaxy to be part of by two physicists working independently on the same problem from different directions. Dr. Halvorsen in Oslo, working on structural problems for long-duration space construction. Dr. Yuan in Chengdu, working on material behavior under extreme and sustained stress. They had arrived at the same theoretical framework 6 months apart and spent 2 years arguing about it before deciding they agreed with each other. The theory proposed a class of material configurations, not specific materials, but classes of molecular arrangement that would allow certain substances to exceed standard tensile thresholds by a factor of several hundred. Not by changing the material itself, but by changing the dynamic relationship between its components under specific field conditions. It was precise, testable, and unusual. It made predictions that standard material physics said were impossible. When humanity joined the Galactic Consortium, the consortium reviewed the Halvorsen-Yuan theory as part of the standard scientific knowledge exchange. They found 6 points of theoretical imprecision areas where the math was not clean, where the predictions did not fully account for observed edge cases. They wrote a formal review. They classified the theory as speculative overreach. They shelved it politely, with compliments on the creativity of the approach. Human engineers read the review, noted the 6 criticisms, addressed 4 of them within the decade, and kept using the theory anyway because it worked. Not perfectly. Not in every situation, but in the margins where it mattered in the structural calculations for large-scale construction, in the materials specification for the generation ships that humanity had already been building before anyone else knew they existed. It kept producing results that were accurate. The 2 remaining unresolved criticisms were edge cases. They only appeared at scales that human engineering had not yet reached. Mara pulled out her notebook and opened it to the page where she had written the material requirements from the wall's engineering proof. She ran the Halvorsen-Yuan calculations against those requirements. She ran them 3 times because she wanted to be sure. The material the wall described the specific molecular configuration required to achieve the tensile strength the engineering proof demanded was impossible under standard consortium materials physics. Impossible cleanly, completely, with no room for interpretation. Under Halvorsen-Yuan, it was achievable. Not easy, not simple, but achievable. The theory described a class of configurations that would produce exactly the tensile properties the proof required if you had the right field conditions and the right base material and enough patience. She sat with this for a long time. What she was holding was this. A theory, developed by two humans, independently, on a single planet, before humanity had any contact with the broader galaxy, produced the only framework in known science that could make the engineering proof on this wall physically real. There were a few ways to read that. The first was coincidence. Human physics had stumbled into the same territory as an ancient extinct civilization, and the overlap was meaningful but not connected. Parallel development happened in science. It was documented and common. The second was that the Halvorsen-Ewan theory was simply correct, and the consortium's dismissal of it had been the error, and any sufficiently advanced civilization working on large-scale construction would eventually arrive at the same framework, because the physics pointed there, whether you liked it or not. The third possibility, she did not write down. She let it sit at the edge of her thinking, and did not look at it directly. She went to find Delvin. She found him in the records tent with Fell and two of the other senior researchers, running independent verification of the Base 11 framework, as he had said they would. He looked up when she came in with the expression of a man who was in the process of confirming something he had not wanted to confirm, and did not particularly need more news on top of it. She put her notebook on the table in front of him, open to the Halvorsen-Ewan calculations. She explained what she had done. She explained the theory, its history, its development, the consortium's review, the 4 resolved criticisms, the 2 remaining edge cases. She explained that human engineers had continued to use it, and why. She explained what happened when you applied it to the material requirements of the engineering proof on the wall. She said, "It's the only framework that makes the proof physically possible." Delvin looked at the notebook for a long time without speaking. Fell leaned over and looked at it too. His face did the honest thing again, the thing it had done that morning when he saw the color-coded stroke analysis. It said, "This is real, and I am going to have to do something with it." The consortium reviewed this theory, Delvin said carefully. There were significant. 4 of the 6 criticisms were resolved by 2180, Mara said. The remaining 2 are edge cases that don't appear below a certain construction scale. The Orath structure is above that scale. Delvin said nothing. "The theory works," she said. "We kept using it because it works." The tent was quiet. Outside, the wind moved across the ruins with the soft, indifferent sound it had been making for 40,000 years, passing over stones that held mathematics that nobody had been able to read until 3 days ago. Delvin looked at the notebook. He looked at the wall, visible through the open tent flap. He looked at the notebook again. He said, "There is one more question." Mara waited. "If the theory is correct," he said, "and the material was achievable, why has no record of this civilization survived anywhere in consortium archives? A species capable of this engineering would have left traces. Trade. Contact. Conflict. Something." Mara picked up her notebook. "I know," she said. "I'm working on that." She walked back to the wall. The border had always been there. Every expedition had noted it. Every published report had described it. Every photograph in the consortium's Orath Secundus archive included it. The repeating symbol that ran in a continuous strip along the top edge of the wall and the bottom edge of the wall, framing the entire engineering proof like a border on a document, unbroken, consistent, identical at every point along its length. "Decorative," said the first expedition. "Decorative," said the second, the third, and the fourth. "Decorative," said Delvin in print, twice, in 2 separate peer-reviewed publications, with supporting analysis from the Quarathi specialist team. Mara crouched at the bottom edge of the wall, near the cracked tile where she had started, and looked at the border symbol for a long time. It was a single compound glyph. She could see that now, with the Base 11 framework in her head, the same stroke components used everywhere else on the wall, combined in a specific positional arrangement. Not decoration, not a frame. A symbol. One that repeated because the same symbol appeared at the top and the bottom, enclosing the proof inside it, the way you enclose a statement with punctuation. She converted it. The positional calculation was not complex. She had been doing them for 3 days. Her hand moved through it almost without thinking, the notation translating to Base 11 numerical value in less than a minute. The value was a very large number. She looked at it. A large number, by itself, meant nothing. Numbers needed context. They needed a system of reference, something to measure from, something to count toward. Without a calendar, without knowing what unit the ancient civilization had used for time, this number was just a number, big and old and unreadable. Except, she stared at it. She thought about orbital mechanics, the movement of stars, the way civilizations measured time using the sky, because the sky was the only clock that never needed winding and never ran down. She thought about how many different civilizations had independently arrived at the same base unit for timekeeping, the orbital period of their home planet around its star. Different lengths, different names, but the same concept. The year, the most natural measure of duration that any planet-born species would develop. She thought about what kind of star produced an orbital period close enough to a standard that you could convert between them with simple arithmetic. She did the conversion. Then she did it again. Then she sat back on her heels on the cold stone floor and looked at the number she had written in her notebook and did not move for a while. The border symbol was a date, expressed in a time unit that corresponded within the margin of error that came from 40,000 years of physical decay, affecting the carving depth, and therefore the precision of her stroke measurements to a year. A year counted from a fixed astronomical reference point. A point in space. A position of a specific star at a specific moment, used as the ground zero of a calendar, the way all calendars needed a ground zero to count from. The Galactic Consortium did not recognize this reference point. No record in the consortium's unified archives matched the astronomical coordinates she was working backward toward, which meant the ancient Veth civilization or whoever had carved this wall, whatever they were, had used a calendar system completely their own, unknown, unrecorded, lost with everything else they had been. She should have stopped there. She did not stop there. She converted the date one more time. Not into consortium standard. Into a different system, an older one, smaller, parochial, the timekeeping of a single species on a single planet, who had looked at their own star from their own ground and counted their years without knowing anyone else was counting. The number came out the same every time she ran it. 43,211 years ago, give or take a century. Her measurement precision was not perfect. The carving was old, and the stone had shifted, but the range was narrow. 43,000 years. 43,200 years at the outside. She knew that number. Every human schoolchild knew that number, because it was in the textbooks, because it was in the genetic record of every human alive, written into their DNA in the specific way that a disaster leaves a mark. The Toba catastrophe. A supervolcanic eruption on a small planet in an unremarkable solar system, 74,000 years ago. No, wait. That was the event itself, the eruption, the genetic bottleneck, the near extinction, the point at which the human population had dropped so low that the whole species had nearly ended, 43,000 years ago. The border symbol on this wall was a date, carved into stone by an ancient civilization on a planet that was not Earth, in a number system that humanity had not invented, using a calendar that the rest of the galaxy did not recognize. The date was the moment humanity had almost ceased to exist, carved here 43,000 years ago, 43,000 years before humanity reached the stars, 43,000 years before humanity reached this wall, 43,000 years before anyone could have known to look for it, or known what it meant, or known that the species it marked would survive long enough to come and read it. Mara sat on the floor of the ruin and looked at her notebook and did not move. She had been in this field for 12 years. She had sat with important discoveries before smaller ones, the kind that shifted a specific academic debate or opened a new line of research. She knew what that felt like. The particular mental sensation of a piece of the world clicking into a new position. This did not feel like that. This felt like standing in a room and watching the walls get larger. Behind her, she could hear the expedition starting its morning. Voices from the records tent. The hum of instruments. The sound of Delvin speaking in the measured, important way he had when he was beginning the day's formal work. The ordinary sounds of serious people doing serious things. She thought about the third possibility she had not written down the night before. the one she had let sit at the edge of her thinking and refused to look at directly. An ancient civilization had left a date carved into a wall on a planet that was not Earth. The date marked a specific event in human history. The mathematics on the wall was unlocked by a theory that two human physicists had developed independently, without any outside knowledge, on their own. A theory the rest of the galaxy had dismissed as overreach. Either all of this was coincidence, a deep, strange, layered coincidence, the kind that statistics said was possible, even when it felt impossible, or the Halvorsen-Ewan theory was simply where the physics led if you followed it honestly, and the date was a record, a marker, a note left by a civilization that had been watching, that had known, that had seen what happened to that small, young, struggling species, and had chosen to mark the moment in stone and leave it for them to find when they were ready. Or, she did not finish the third possibility even now. She was a scientist. She needed more data. She needed verification and peer review and independent analysis and probably 3 more expeditions and a decade of careful work before she could say anything out loud that would not get her laughed out of the field entirely. She looked at the wall, at the border, at the date, at the engineering proof for a ship that should not have been possible to build, described in mathematics that humanity had independently rediscovered, left here by people whose names she did not know, for reasons she could not yet say with certainty. She pulled out a fresh page of her notebook. She started writing down everything she would need to do next. She wrote for a long time. The sun rose higher than it usually managed on this planet, which meant it was only slightly less pale than usual, and the gray stones of the Veth ruins held the early light the way old stones do, without warmth, but without hostility either. Just holding it, keeping it. Delvin found her there an hour later. He stood behind her and looked at what was on the display she had left, running the border symbol, the conversion, the date, and was quiet for a long time. Then he said, in the voice of a man whose ground has shifted under him and is choosing to remain standing anyway, "Tell me what you need." Mara did not look up from her notebook. "Time," she said, "and a direct line to the consortium's astronomical archives, and more granola bars, because I'm out." She kept writing. The wall kept its silence, as it had for 43,000 years, patient as stone, waiting for the right kind of eyes.